Everybody, welcome to the Swarm.
Welcome to the Swarm, guys. Seamus, we are not recording in our studio. Where are we?
We are not. We are in Ashley Arsenault's studio, also known as Small Chalk, for those of you who are New Orleanians, and also just adjacent to Minmu's studio. We're recording on the road again.
Yeah, so thank you to Minmu and Small Chalk for letting us use their space. This is a very unique episode, ladies
It's
and
always a
gentlemen.
unique episode,
It always
James.
is. I know.
This is kind of like, fantastic.
This is my fantastic.
Okay.
We are specifically talking about the Rivergate, which is a building that no longer exists. It originally was built and demolished in downtown New Orleans. It was used as a convention center, exhibition hall, and it is very unique both structurally and architecturally, and it has a very interesting story. There's two parts to this. One, which is the poetry and the design of this building. And if you're interested in architecture and design, even if you're not, this episode really harps on why people go into architecture, what they teach us in architecture school, which is truly the design of how a human experiences a space. Correct. And how you can use materiality to influence how you experience a space. And then the other side of the story is that there's an event coming up.
There's an event coming up. The NOAF, the New Orleans Architectural Foundation, along with the PRC NOLA, the Preservation Rescource Center of New Orleans, have come together and they've made what's called a mid-mod series. And so they're basically highlighting mid-century modern buildings around the city. And this, being a very unique one that it no longer exists, they were like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we did a virtual reality exhibition of this building to really be kind of a bookend of their mid-mod series, and so that now, even though you never really experienced this particular building, you can now.
So we had two great guests on this podcast, both of them involved with the Rivergate in two very different ways.
So we have John Klingman. He is the Professor Emeritus of Architecture at the Tulane University of Architecture. And in 1994, he was actually part of the group called the Friends of the Rivergate.
Which another collaborator in the Friends of the Rivergate was actually the original architect of the Rivergate building.
That's correct.
Who was also this part of the same firm who designed the Superdome.
Exactly. We also interviewed Joel Pominville, who is the executive director of the American Institute of Architects of the New Orleans chapter, and also the director of the New Orleans Foundation of Architecture. He will really harp on the experience of the Rivergate tour itself and what you can expect.
So the guys at Cicada actually had a really cool opportunity to be involved in the event. We got to collaborate with a bunch of other architects in New Orleans to actually recreate the building digitally. We all worked on our separate computers and our separate offices and built it collaboratively in the cloud so that they could export it into a virtual reality experience.
Right. So for those of you who don't know, James, maybe working for Cicada, is clicking the mouse while another individual could be at their studio, literally working on the same model at the same time for the same cause, just to make this event happen. It's really kind of like the first of, from my understanding, that this has ever happened in the city. Right.
We're living in the future to create something that no longer exists just for really the nostalgia factor.
Yeah.
And so if you're listening to this episode before the event, we really encourage you to go to it and experience the Rivergate in virtual reality. A lot of effort has been put into recreating this building. And if you don't get a chance to do it, please just look it up online. It's very beautiful. We definitely talk about the architecture and the engineering behind it. But it's very unique, and it no longer exists. So this is kind of just a little time capsule
a little
event.
homage.
A little homage. Hi, everyone. I'm James.
And I am Seamus, and you are listening to
The Swarm,
a podcast about architecture and design.
We're two architects at the firm Cicada here in New Orleans.
The Swarm is an outlet that brings the world of architecture to the people.
Our goal is to educate our listeners about design and construction by interviewing locals who are making an impact on their community. So I think we should just dive right into it. John, why is this building important? What is this building and why is it important?
This building was completed in 1968 and at the time, it was one of the longest thin shell reinforced concrete clear span structures in the world.
In the world?
In the world.
Wow.
With a span of over 250 feet, which is 5/6 of a football field. Designed as a convention center, the notion was that clear span was important because columns would get in the way of whatever the exhibits or the purpose of this open space. So Curtis and Davis designed this thing as really at the cutting edge of architectural technology at the time. The concrete structure generally is only about 4 inches thick, and that's why it's called a shell structure. The word shell comes from eggshell. If you think about eggshells, they're extremely strong, and the reason they're strong is in part because of the strength of the material itself, but in part because of the shape. And this is the same idea about thin shell concrete structures, that because the shapes were vaults, they were all curved, there was an inherent strength in the shape of the structure. So this is something that architects and engineers around the world were starting to investigate really beginning in the 1930s, but the high point was probably in the 1960s.
John, tell us where did the Rivergate sit? Where was its particular site?
In the early 1960s, the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans decided that international trade was an important aspect of the city's burgeoning tourist condition. So 2 structures were proposed on the river, and they required the demolition of a number of historic buildings on the site between Poydras Street, Canal Street, the river, and South Peters. So one of the buildings was a tall building called the World Trade Center, designed by the preeminent American architect Edward Drell Stone, a cruciform skyscraper, and the other was a convention center to host international trade called the Rivergate, designed by Curtis and Davis. These buildings were thought about as a pair. Unfortunately, the kind of conjunction of the buildings urbanistically didn't make a lot of sense. The World Trade Center still exists. It was originally called the International Trade Mart. Its original head was a man named Clay Shaw, who became famous as part of the Garrison investigation into the JFK murder. And of the 2 buildings, the one that was architecturally the most interesting was the Rivergate. Ironically, the Rivergate no longer exists,
Right.
And now the tall structure has been deemed for renovation into a hotel and condo complex.
But has been abandoned for some time.
And has been abandoned for maybe 15 years.
Right now, Joel just actually pulled up an image on
A very early image.
of both the Rivergate and the World Trade Center. It's a model, correct?
They were supposed to be linked by a plaza, but the city instead made a street in between them. So it was never a very successful urban strategy.
John, enlighten me. Was this pre-convention center? Like, there was no convention center at the time, right? This was the convention center. This was the OG convention center.
So the convention center before this was the municipal auditorium.
Okay, got it.
Which is the building that confronts Congo Square.
Okay.
And that was from the 30s. So that was the large municipal space for Mardi Gras parades, for exhibitions, for anything that demanded a large public space.
Was this part of the World Fair in any way? Was that affiliated, or did they use it for the World Fair?
In some ways, I think the World's Fair doomed the convention center.
Oh, okay.
One of the problems with architecture that is at the cutting edge is that something is always going to replace it and be the next cutting edge thing. The Rivergate was cutting edge in 1968. By the mid-1980s, all of the architectural emphasis in New Orleans was about the Louisiana World Exposition of 1984, in which a gigantic new convention center was going to be built along the river that would dwarf the size of the Rivergate. So that then made the Rivergate essentially obsolete as a convention center, and that was one of the issues about its ultimate demise.
There you go, James. So
So they just built something bigger, and at the time they deemed better.
I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's very, in my opinion, terrible, but it's no different than like the FIFAs of the world or the Olympics coming into town and they're building all these new things and they're tearing down a bunch of stuff. I mean, the World's Fair was kind of like that in its day.
Well, it's interesting because clearly there's still use for a very large open space in New Orleans, especially nowadays.
But the Rivergate was landlocked. There was no way, either architecturally or urbanistically, for the Rivergate to expand because of the importance of Poydras and Canal Streets. So when there was an idea about building a new convention center that started at Julia Street in conjunction with the 1984 fair, there was no limits on the degree to which it could expand upriver, and we've seen that. It's now, there were 3 phases. That building is now, 3/4 of a mile long, and there's even a 4th phase that was scheduled that probably isn't going to come to fruition. So in some ways for the city it made sense, and I think New Orleans, the convention center, became among the top half dozen in the country in terms of its square footage, which is important for national conventions. So in that way, Rivergate as a building made a tremendous amount of sense architecturally. As an expandable convention center, it was not flexible in that way.
So from 86 and then its demolition in 95, I mean, are those the dark days? I mean, what's happening in between that time frame?
The convention center, the current convention center, was opened in 1984 in conjunction with the exposition. So that meant from 1984 on, the Rivergate was a white elephant. It was in search of a program. And so consequently, it was vulnerable to, the site was vulnerable to adaptive reuse or to anything else that was coming along the pike. And this was at a time when the notion of casino gambling began to enter the discourse in New Orleans. The city of New Orleans controlled the site, and then a gigantic argument soon ensued about whether the site was more important for the construction of a new casino or whether the Rivergate itself would make a great casino. And that was the highly discussed issue of 1994.
So how long did that battle ensue? Like, how long was this argument going on?
And who was mayor at the time?
It was about a year. So the mayorship was changing from Sidney Barthélemy to Marc Morial at the time that this occurred. But the large political discussions were happening in Baton Rouge, as is so often the case in New Orleans politics, as we saw again after Katrina. Edwin Edwards was the governor, and he was a highly vocal promoter of casino gambling in New Orleans. So he was able to orchestrate the process such that the city had rather limited control over what was happening with respect to a land-based casino.
Got it. I'm looking at, I mean, why not gamble in the Rivergate, you know? Why you gotta demo it?
It would have been perfect.
I mean, you got a perfectly beautiful structure. I will say this for the record. In our previous podcast, I was totally hating on the Rivergate, and solely because I didn't do enough research on it. I'm gonna
Seamus
put that
was
out
just
there.
glancing over my shoulder when I was thumbing through it, and he was like,
Hey.
"Why is this building so significant?" And I was just like, "Seamus, I don't have enough time."
I was
to
looking
explain
at
this
bird's
to you."
eye view. It looks so heavy and long and whatever, and then you start.
I think that's the beauty of it, is that it's this concrete cloud that's floating, literally floating above a enormous amount of space.
Look, I just wanted to come clean. I did hate on the building. I'm coming along here.
I think to this advancements in material science, really, in methodology for architecture at that time, the building's roof structure was sitting on 21 columns. You'll see that all the conference rooms and all the bathrooms and every auxiliary space, is actually separate from that main structure. So it feels extraordinarily light when you're inside.
You can see the expression of the structure, and it's done very well. It's very elegant. And in contrast to that, you have the Superdome, which is also a large, heavy structure that is a roof over a very large volume of space. But you can see the amount of weight that it takes to the structure that it takes to hold up something like that, where the Rivergate looks like it's just floating.
The columns were 4 feet and smaller, actually, right? Their bases were 4 feet wide.
Yeah. So the 21 columns were in 3 rows of 7. And the span between the columns was 60 feet.
What?
Which is fairly large.
That's literally wider than any typical New Orleans lot.
That's
the
right.
width.
Exactly
so
right.
A typical New Orleans width lot is 30 by 120.
Exactly.
So 2 lots wide.
That's right, exactly, 2 lots
obnoxious.
wide. And at the edges of those 7 columns, there were cantilevers where the structure fanned out 30 feet cantilevers and the columns that Joel referred to, they were 4 feet at the base, but they tapered into a thinner section at the middle. And at the middle, they were only 12 inches by 12 inches. They were incredibly slender. And the only reason they could be so slender was because the building was so lightweight. It didn't look so lightweight because there was a parapet around the edge that was about 7 feet high that made it look like it was 7 feet thick of concrete. But that was another shell that was only 4 inches thick. So if you look at photographs of the building under construction, you see that the scaffolding that was used to support the concrete was incredibly thin because the weight of the concrete was so light, even though the building looked heavy. So it was a building of contrast.
It's worth noting the structural engineer on this job, John, while we're talking about the architects.
His name was Skillings.
Okay.
And he was a very important and innovative structural engineer who I believe also had trainings as an architect.
Okay.
So, and he and Curtis, Buster refers to him quite frequently in discussions about the building, worked hand in hand.
Okay.
Because the building is really as much about structural expressionism as it is about architecture. And in fact, that was one of the fatal flaws of the building, which was that from the outside, along the 2 public sides of the building, on the sides toward facing Canal Street and the sides facing Poydras, the building was pretty nasty.
John, elaborate a little bit more on, so clearly, you were with the friends of those who were trying to preserve and keep this for the new casino. Elaborate a little bit more on where that direction went for the solution, or at least for the existing building, and then its demise of the actual demo.
The small group of people, including Donna Robertson, the dean of the School of Architecture at Tulane, myself, Buster Curtis, Gene Sizik, several other, Betty Moss, a really interesting modernist architect from New Orleans, really orchestrated the effort. We were able to get in to see the incoming mayor, Mark Morial, just before he took office. And he let us spend 2 hours with him, convincing him, or arguing, I should say, to him about the merits of the Rivergate and how it would make a fabulous casino. And he was very solicitous. The reason was that his dad had been mayor during the time of the Superdome. The Superdome was supposed to be a giant New Orleans catastrophe of overspending and corruption. And so the newspapers were kind of writing it up that way, but it turned out that the Superdome came in under budget and on time, thanks to Buster Curtis, the architect. And Dutch Morial never forgot the fact that he owed the success of this huge project to Buster Curtis, the architect. So his son, when he became mayor, recognized that he needed to, or he wanted to, pay attention to Buster because of the incredible success story that the Superdome had been. So therefore, Mark was willing to listen to us. The problem was that the argument wasn't about architecture. The argument was about money. And if the our proposal had been accepted, the city probably would have spent, or not the city, but the developer would have, this is the point, the developer would have spent maybe somewhere between $100 and $200 million.
Wow.
By tearing down the building and starting over, the developer spent $700 million.
So it came down to money.
It was
came down to the
completely about
investor.
money. It was
And
completely
even
about
though,
money.
so there was a chance. There were a lot of arguments for keeping it, but in the end, it never had a chance. So they demoed the building.
Well, okay, so there's a story there
There's
too.
more.
There's a story there. So the construction demolition firm said, we're going to demo it in a month. And we said, this building is very substantial. And it actually took them 4 months to demolish it.
John, did they say it was going to take them a month because of the thinness of the concrete?
They didn't really understand the building.
Yeah.
They just, at first they were going to implode it.
Oh, what?
And
Okay, I talk about blowing up buildings more often than I
James has been wanting to. James still wants charity to be imploded.
No.
Oh, coming on the record.
That should not be on the record.
Totally on the record.
But I'm
not what I
speaking into
said.
the microphone so that it should be on the record.
This is
we're leaving it in.
This is with a commentary.
We're leaving it in because it's.
If a building ends up succumbing to its own demise, whether it be financial or whatever, I think blowing it up is a beautiful way to go. I'm not saying charity should be blown up. I'm saying
Word.
if charity has to be demolished, it would be cool to see it.
Let's be clear.
explode.
James just really likes things to be blown up.
I think you should. I think charity is missing just one thing, and that's just a paint job. You know, hot pink. It needs to be hot pink, and people would be like, "Wow."
Or a lot of dynamite.
Or a lot of dynamite.
One of those two things.
But that's another podcast.
Yeah.
That is another podcast. Sorry. Anyway,
So all of this to lead up to it is now gone, and if we want to experience it, we can. Joel, how do we experience the Rivergate?
At the beginning of the planning for the 2018 mid-mod series, when PRC and Docomomo and NOAF were in the room, we're talking about the various array of events that we can do, and there was a point that I said, well, virtual reality has got to be right. I'm blown away by this building, and I was already in love with it before I researched it as heavily as I have done now. About 10 architects and engineers from across the deep reaches of New Orleans have come together and reconstructed this building in a three-dimensional digital model. I think it just makes so much sense. Architects, building professionals, contractors, engineers use virtual reality to show something that does not exist yet. And I think that the only way we could draw this up, render it 100 times on two-dimensional paper, there is no better case for architecture than
Joel, I think it's
reality.
it's an amazing concept idea. I'm glad you have spearheaded this event, because for the people like myself, I'm born in '85. The building was demolished in '95, and God help me,
You're
but
an architect.
and I am an architect, but I never had the good fortune to go enjoy it. And so, for people like myself, people who are from out of town, really anyone, this is now the opportunity to experience something like you're saying now, post demo through VR. Which, I mean, this is an opportunity to really embrace technology. So Joel, you gave us a call at Cicada, and you said, "Hey, look, I know you do a podcast. I know you do 3D printing and other things. We would love for you guys to be involved in this situation. But it's not just us in this; it's a lot of other people. So can you elaborate on who else is involved in putting this together?"
Yeah, so I think I'd like to start with the Southeastern Architectural Archive at the Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane. Also, the people that built this building in 3D, M3 Design Group, Cicada lent a hand as well, Pace Group, Studio BKA, a couple individuals as well, Emile Lejeune and Sim Ward. There's somebody else that I'm missing too, but those people, thank you for making this thing possible. and then Letterman's for making the
Of
exhibit
course.
possible, right? The event is Thursday, July 26th. From 6 to 9 p.m. You're going to be able to get there, have a beer. There's only about 20 to 25 people allowed in the room at a time, just because the nature of having people spin around with a phone in their hand and a little goggle set. That's not a good scenario in a tight space. So you're going to be able to walk in and see the Rivergate through various points in the building. There will also be an opportunity to walk around the building with an Xbox controller, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a couple other things, surprises that I'm not going to tell you about
Okay, cool.
right now.
Short and sweet.
I'm scared.
Your thoughts on the existing building that is currently in the place of the Rivergate, the Harris Casino, formally as an architectural piece?
Well, from the beginning, it was obvious to everyone in the architectural community that there was really no point in discussing this pastiche of balloons and flags and the most unfortunate aspects of a sort of fantasy reconstruction of architecture. And I don't think that impression has changed among anybody. And unfortunately, the building's at its best from the outside. If you go in the building, and I will say I've been in it once, it's absolutely anywhere. It has nothing to do with any kind of architecture.
John, did you win any money, though?
No.
I have spent $1 in the.
Did you
Harris Casino.
lose any money there?
No.
All right, that's good.
I've spent $1 in the Harris. I've only been in there once as well.
And you got a free drink.
I did get a free drink.
I did that
I was
too.
not expecting that, actually.
I did that too once, knowing I would get a free drink.
Yeah. Very same sentiment as well.
My feelings of the building are I mean, it's very clear that the same urban conditions that I believe were served as a problem with the Rivergate still exist, right? I don't think that building does not in any more reasonable manner approach the people of this city, but programmatically it's a casino. You've got people walking around a casino at all times. So I genuinely believe those same conditions that were very clear in a building that was only activated X amount of times throughout the year, had it just remained the same, turned into a casino, would have been a completely different, those lack of urban condition and meeting the street would not have been as stark because the program was a highly activated year-round program.
Okay, but
And it's an awful, in my opinion, it's a terrible
Yes,
replacement.
there it is.
but
What?
Of great architecture.
But I think Joel's comments, Ray, the Canal Street side, are highly accurate. I think Harris has recognized that, and on the other side, they've made Fulton Street into a mini French Quarter.
They have.
And now they want to put a covering over it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they want to put a glass canopy over that street to make it even more usable. And of course, next they'll want to make it air conditioned.
That's the first thing I thought of was Vegas, that giant
Whatever,
canopy
James.
over old.
If you think that's
old-
Vegas,
No, well, no. Architecturally, just like this giant
No, you're
covering that means like.
You know what
right,
it is? It's one of the Fulton Street is one of the first steps that capital cities, which are often lacking in a lot of culture, that scenario that they have with Fulton Street is the first step that capital cities engage with to try to bring bar life and coffee life and dinner life. I mean, like food
Right,
life
of
back
course.
into and I actually don't. I'm not hating on that concept. I just think it felt very much like a.
it's a little forced.
Yeah, it's a little
Well,
forced.
but you could have still had that same idea and life and energy with the existing building. You didn't have to get rid of it.
I still think it's like I said. I still think it's healthy to have bodies moving
Yeah, for sure.
around.
And I think this is why people love New Orleans. Is people love New Orleans because of its authenticity. And if you start to replicate that in some other way, you're falsifying the authenticity. and it waters it down. We're already so wet here. We don't need to water anything more down.
We're excited about this event. I think it's definitely the first step in a longer process of recognizing buildings, both past buildings and really potentially to use this tool to talk about our city in the future.
Sounds great.
Well, we appreciate both of you coming on with us, and we appreciate your opinion.